Welcome everyone, men, women and the children at home, out of school, I'm guessing, it's June. Today we are talking about the worst class in the game, because recently, a couple of days ago, Blizzard, together with the many announcements that came in the beta of The War Within on this last reset, there was also the announcement of the impending, incoming changes to Shaman. And Shaman is our worst class in the game right now. Now, there might be some specs individually which might be in a worse position than one of these specs, but in general, as a class as a whole, they are definitely doing the worst right now. Even you, non-Shaman players, might have seen the wave of complaints recently about the state of Shamans. So let's shed some light on what are these issues, now that we know that perhaps not a full-scale rework, but some significant changes are coming to Shaman. So what exactly do we want to see for each of these specs to see them improve? Do we want to see talents removed, talents added, change in their playstyle, in their rotation, having more cooldowns, more defensives, more utility, etc, etc. So we are starting with what is perhaps the least of the problems, which is Enhancement Shaman. So enhancement, similar to what we will see with Elemental, they have this kind of split issue where they have the Storm build, which is much more nature and lightning damage focused. They put more points into Wind Fury damage, into Storm Strike and Storm Strike damage, and more passive single target damage rather than playing with the Elemental Blast build. They again have more Storm Strike damage and lightning damage, and then they have the Elementalist build playing around Elemental Blast, a whole bunch of fire damage spreading around your Flame Shock for AoE, having very short, consistent, powerful cooldowns in both Feral Spirit and this very high uptime Mega Haste buff that you can get as enhancement. Nowadays, this isn't even a proper split because the Storm build has been so weak in the last couple of seasons that most Enhancement Shaman are simply defaulting to the Elementalist build. If you want to go in AoE, you add a couple of talents, otherwise you keep the single target ones, and then you just keep going with this same build. Now, even those who don't play Shaman and Enhancement Shaman might be confused, because they're like, it's been a while now that I've heard many praises and pats in the back because of how well Enhancement plays. I often hear Enhancement mentioned as one of the specs with the coolest rotation, the best play style that is very satisfying and nice to play, which is still correct. You can still have problems while having a pretty engaging rotation to play as a spec. Now, problem number one for Enhancement is strictly a more AoE focused one, which is their target caps. Enhancement doesn't have many ways to hit more than 5 or 6 targets. Their Trash Lightning has damage reduction past 6 targets. Their Chain Lightning cannot hit that many targets. Using their empowered Frost Shock through Hailstorm, again, hits at most 6 targets as well. So in general, they are quite capped in AoE damage. Their cooldowns don't actually give them more AoE damage, they just make them stronger, but stronger still within their target caps. So the problem with Enhancement starts at their target cap. The other problem for Enhancement is this divide still between the two builds being a little bit too drastic on whether or not you want to do more AoE or more single target damage. We have seen before Blizzard fixing these problems on a handful of other specs, losing a bit too much for going in single target or in AoE. Talent, for example, Red Paladin was having somewhat more of a similar issue in Dragonflight, and then since the rework and further changes, they have been streamlined way more. So that is perhaps something Enhancement Shaman are looking for when it comes to the changes coming next week for the spec. Having a more blended in set of talents rather than having to be way more split in their options, as well as a wider target cap for their AoE, are amongst the more high priority wanted changes for Enhancement as a spec. We have to fall one step deeper though and talk about Elemental, because at first glance Elemental is on a similar level than Enhancement when you look at their two sets of talent trees for single target, playing with Ice Fury, playing with Elemental Blast, playing with more damage on their finishers and more straight up damage with Lava Burst, and then the AoE side of the build, playing around more with Liquid Magma Totem, spreading your Flame Shocks around for tons of Lava Surge procs, so you can spam Lava Burst even more, proc DRE and Ascendance even more, get so many casts of Lava Burst that you practically reduce the cooldown of Primordial Wave down to like 10 seconds to constantly have it active, giving you even more active haste, similar to Enhancement Shaman. However, there is an issue, because when it comes to enhancement, you might get away with this type of different playstyle because you still play well. Players are still engaged by the rotation of Enhancement Shaman. So even being split into different builds, maybe some players not enjoying nearly as much the more RNG heavy part of the Storm build compared to the Elementalist build, but the playstyle is still enjoyable by most. The issue is that not only are you having these talent, split problems, it's the fact that the rotation is also terrible. Whether or not you're focusing on Lava Burst in AoE, or with Chain Lightning Earthquake in AoE, or in single target, you end up having a very streamlined rotation of practically a couple of buttons. That is the generic issue for Elemental Shaman. If you want to be even more precise, it's Lava Burst. Lava Burst has too much power. It has too many talents designed to give you more Lava Burst power. The more Flame Shock ticks, the more times you proc the reset of Lava Burst and the insta-cast of Lava Burst, which makes you cast even more Lava Burst, which gives you more chances to proc DRE, which makes you cast more Lava Burst, and the more you are casting, the more you are resetting the cooldown of Primordial Wave, which makes you cast even more Lava Bursts. That's the issue of Elemental Shamans. Elemental Shamans have long since forgotten the feeling of what Earthshock even is, because if you even bother to use a spender in single target, you are using Elemental Blast. You aren't even bothering to use Earthshock anymore. There is still this very annoying issue around Ice Fury, which feels like a complete rotation breaker and sets you off of your flow, having to use these 4 insta-cast Frost Shocks in between your rotation. You are supposed to be an Elemental Shaman, yet your Elementals are garbage, ever since Shadowlands even, when the absolute meme nerf of Storm Elemental happened. It hasn't even been fixed or received a compensation buff after the nerfs of Shadowlands, and is still absolutely terrible. So the issues here run deeper than enhancement, because enhancement, despite their talent placement and power options of certain buttons, it still plays well. It is still satisfying to play for many players in both of the builds, whereas for Elemental it's kind of the same problem for both builds. It's bad. It's bad on both sides of the spectrum. And this has been going on for a while, even back in Shadowlands or even in BFA, when one of the major builds was perma, spam, lightning bolt, and then use Earthshock. And that was the whole thing in your build. Blizzard has been so far wholly incapable of giving you a good builder-spender flow to your spec. Something that they have been able to do to specs like Demo or Destruction, or specs like Red Paladin, specs with builder-spender playstyle. Apparently, this hasn't really been worked nearly as well when it comes to Elemental Shaman. So for enhancement, talent problems, splitting the Storm and Lightning builds too much from the Fire and AoE build, and being target capped, despite still having a pretty good and satisfying rotation. For Elemental, it's still talent issues, still being split too much around Fire, AoE damage, and single target damage, but the problem is also the rotation. Abilities that lost their purpose or their power, like Earthshock, like Ice Fury, like your Elemental, and too much focus on Lava Burst. Now, talent-wise, the one with the least problems is Earth Shaman. Earth Shaman right now is easily the best of the Shaman specs in terms of, their state right now. Even in the results of the beta, Earth Shaman was doing, reasonably well in terms of healing. It was a pretty strong spec, it still is in the beta, so it's not that it's weak compared to, for example, the state of the DPS of Elemental in the beta, which is much worse, for example, right? But for Shaman, the talent problem isn't even that big of an issue. Most of their talents are fine, they are powerful enough. It does have still some woeful things that you want to see changed in the upcoming changes to Shaman, like for example the two worst talents possibly in the game, Earth and Harmony and Ancestral Awakening. In Season 1 of Dragonflight, at least they made Ancestral Awakening less terrible because they created Tidebringer. So now you don't have to get to your very powerful last talent point here going through Ancestral Awakening. Now you completely forget this exists and you go there through Tidebringer, but this is still a problem because it's dreadful, and also Earth and Harmony, even after it was buffed with the DR, is still a terrible talent, and they are 2-pointers, which is even worse. That is perhaps one of the bigger offenders in this tree. Look at this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. 10 sets of 2 talent pointers in the entire tree is practically an embarrassment. Just look at one of the most recent reworked specs, right? To see the modern take of talents, look at Beast Mastery Hunter. How many 2 talent points do they have? They have 1, they have 2, they have 3, and 4 and 5. Instead of 10, so they have half as many. When it comes to Marksmanship Hunter, they have a grand total of 1 and 2 talent points compared to the 10 of Restoration Shaman. So the problem with the Restoration is not really about the terrible talents, it only has a couple of them, maybe 3 of them. It's more like the 2 talent pointers and how ancient it looks like, but both in terms of power of the spec right now, the power of the talents, even the power of the hero talents, since Totemic is one of the stronger hero talent, synergy with a spec for Restoration Shaman, actually. The problem for Resto might be a little bit more philosophical. The philosophy of casting too many chain heals and having too much power in the healing of chain heal seems to be one of the more, one of the bigger pet peeves of some Resto Shaman players. The fact that right now in your talent tree, you have 1 talent to buff your chain heal, you have 2 talents, Unleash Life, to buff your chain heal, you have 3 talents, you have 4 talents with High Tide, you have 5 talents with Tidal Waves, and even 6 talents with Flash Flood. Your tier set buffs Tidal Waves to give you even more haste on your chain heal casts. You even have Totemic, mentioned as the strong hero talent for Resto Shaman. You have Lively Totems, which gives you an instacast chain heal whenever you put down one of your strong totems, and the buffs you gain from putting down Surging Totem can also go to empower your chain heal. So that is perhaps the bigger of the issues when it comes to Resto Shaman. Not really most of these talents being terrible, it's more about the amount of power put into chain heal and you not really having many other ways to actually heal players right now, besides having very powerful casts of chain heal. That's the, generally speaking, only main problem for Resto right now when it comes to talents and to spec related talents. However, while these 3 specs might be having some issues in their talent tree, there is perhaps something even bigger, which isn't something that they have individually, is something that they all share equally, which is the general talent tree. Now, we have made the same example looking at other specs, like we started with Hunter, for example. The same logic can be applied to the general hero talent tree. Hunter right now has 1, 2, a grand total of 2 2-point talents in the general tree. Meanwhile, Shaman, on the other hand, has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 different 2 talent points in the general tree. I just looked, and the average of the other classes general tree 2 talent pointers is 3.5. So in general, they have 3.5 talent points, being 2 points. Meanwhile, Shaman has 9. So they have, on average, to spend 5.5 more talent points just to fill out their tree. Not to mention, they are so old, they still have many 2 talent points in their normal tree. We mentioned Restoration Shaman having 10 2 talent points, but Enhancement has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So, we're still talking about some ridiculous amount of 2 talent pointers for the spec tree, not just the general tree of the class. There is also another cool issue about the general tree. I'm saying cool, it's actually depressing, that would be the definition. Once you go past the starting points, in terms of amount of clickable buttons you can get from the general tree, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. 20 buttons, 20 possible buttons to put on your bars in the general tree of Shaman. On average, the other specs have between 8 and 12. Shaman has 20. And that's the problem, not just about these 20 buttons, is how niche and unique they are and situational they are. Like, for example, Tranquil Air Totem, Stone Skin Totem, the Totem Repositioning button, Tremor Totem, Stun Totem. You still have things like Hex. So it's a talent tree with, 9 different 2 talent points plus 20 different clickable buttons. It is an abomination of a general tree. And that's not even the core of the issue. Because, if these 2 talent pointers were, for example, reduce damage taken by 5 to 10%, or increase your avoidance by 5 to 10%, or reduce the cooldown of your movement ability by 20 to 25 seconds, then, okay, I would be able to stomach these 2 talent points. Or if some of these abilities were, a second or a third defensive, then I would also be able to stomach these buttons. Unfortunately for Shaman, and that's where the biggest issue is that even through all of these clickable buttons, Shaman is still the squishiest spec in the game with the least amount of defensives. The only proper, real defensive they have is Astral Shift. We have already made an entire video about this. The other things available to them are scuffed and very weak effects that can't possibly even count as a proper defensive, even Ankh itself, which Blizzard stubbornly continues to try to consider a defensive and cockblock Shaman to have another defensive because of Ankh. It is and remains the squishiest spec in the game. So one of the default #1 high priority requests of most Shamans when looking at the incoming changes to the class in a few days is we need more defensives. This one needs to have a default of 2 charges for starters. Earth Elemental needs to be changed, cooldown reduced, give you DR when it comes out, give you an absorb shield when it comes out, do something about it. Give Ankh the same treatment as a cheat death, start giving it a 5-minute cooldown that resets on boss pool, just like any other cheat death of any other spec in the game. For example, start giving, in general, Shaman more defensives. Then there is the oxymoron of the utility. Because technically speaking, Shaman has the most amount of utility in the game in terms of, buttons at your disposal that have some utility. And at the same time, they are also the #1 class that gets kicked out of raids or straight up not invited into raids for not having strong enough utility. That's the other problem around the general tree of the class, and what can the class as a whole bring is proper, strong utility. That is also something dearly missing for Shaman. There needs to be something more than just Windrush Totem. This Stone Skin Totem needs to be a 25% damage reduction, and it needs to hit all the raid, not just 5 allies, so that you can actually and properly use this as a raid cooldown during physical damage fights. For example, Tranquil Air Totem should be able to prevent knockbacks that you can use for the entire raid. Say, for example, Razaget knockbacks. Some kind of utility which might be required in a raid and still be useful in Mythic Plus as well. Not to mention, of course, the much more boring side of utility being a raid buff. Something that at this point only Shamans and DKs are missing completely. So if we were to recap the list of problems we want to see fixed in the incoming set of changes to Shaman, in the general tree and for the class as a whole, we are talking about more meaningful utility and more defensives. And this must come through the general tree in the way of skimming down on some of these 20 different clickable buttons in the tree, as well as significantly slimming down on the massive amount of 2-pointers in the talent tree. When it comes to the individual specs, for elemental, it's actually give them a proper rotation, actually go back to give value to the individual abilities and make them synergize with each other, not make them cannibalize each other. So you want to be able to use Lightning Bolt when you still use Lava Burst, when you still use Earth Shock, and when you can still use Ice Fury, and not just make a couple of these become the predominant buttons you just spam all the time. When it comes to enhancement, while the rotation is still cool and has the least of the issues, perhaps help them out a little bit more in terms of their target cap limitations in AoE, as well as perhaps a more multi-purpose set of talents rather than splitting the single target side so far out compared to the AoE side of the spec. And then when it comes to Restoration Shaman, the least of the problems, skim down on just a handful of useless talents, and then put perhaps back, maybe replace them with talents actually making other abilities other than Chain Heal very powerful. Those seems to be the main concerns right now we might want to see fixed with the changes coming for Resto Shaman by the next reset day in the beta of the War Within, so that when the changes come we can then pull back up this video and compare how many effectively of the issues of the 3 specs and the class as a whole have effectively been fixed. So with this out of the way on this Friday, we are now leaving each other at the beginning of this weekend. We are of course saying goodbye to each other, thanking everyone who is supporting by watching this video or by doing more free things such as liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching, see you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, it's weird. It's 32 degrees right now, which is dreadful, but it doesn't actually feel nearly as hot, and I have no AC.